Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. This week, we're going to talk about managing properties. So managing properties is really where the rubber meets the road. This is where you can make or break the returns on the property you've just purchased. And I'm going to talk about what management covers. It includes self-management or professional management, filling and keeping units occupied, collecting rent, taking maintenance requests, dealing with delinquencies, and evictions. So should you choose to use self-management or professional management? There are really a couple of things you need to think about if to choose one way or the other. It may make sense to self-manage if you have smaller local properties, a single-family home, a fourplex that you can easily manage locally. If you have enough time, if you're a full-time professional, it may not be very easy to find time to manage the property. And also, it may make sense if you have better quality property. If you have a Class A apartment unit or something, that may be a better tenant class that's easier to manage with fewer maintenance requests. Typically, professional management is needed when you start having 20, 30, 100 units because it's just too much for an owner to self-manage. Also, specifically if you're out-of-state properties, if it's a several-hour drive or even an airplane right away, it may not make sense to try to self-manage that. And sometimes lenders, especially big agency lenders, will require professional management on larger properties for them to give a loan. Now, self-management can also include the idea of starting your own management company. It doesn't mean that necessarily the owner is the person going out and doing the work. You could hire people to manage for you. So that's also another side of self-management, which may make sense if you have enough units to hire your own personnel and you can keep that profit in-house versus giving it to a property manager. Filling units. So you have decide if you're going to self-manage or hire a professional management company. Regardless, the first step if you have a property is to fill the available units. And this includes, advertising the units. Some of the things these days that seem to be more popular is using Facebook, Craigslist, Apartments.com, a bunch of these online sites that the younger population really want to use their mobile devices and computers to search for rentals versus the old-fashioned phone. The papers and stuff like that. So make sure you advertise in the right locations to find your tenants. Then after you get an applicant, you need to screen the tenants. That really depends on your process, but you need to be consistent. So you need to look at, do they have enough income to meet your requirements? What's their credit score? Do they have any prior evictions? Do they have any pets? How many people are going to live in the units? You need to be consistent around managing and these tenant applications. And if you reject somebody, make sure you reject them purely based upon your criteria. Don't want to get involved in any kind of fair housing law violations or anything like that. And keep track of why you rejected people. So if there's any question, you have proof of why you rejected that tenant. Once you've approved the tenant, you need to collect, the first month's rent and the security deposit, and then you're going to complete the move-in. That typically is a move-in inspection. Make sure everybody knows what the property looks like. Is there any damage to the unit? Is there anything that you want to record and document before the tenants move in, so it does not become their responsibility when they move out? And also, as the tenant has lived in your property for a while, maybe a 6 month or a year lease, you need to renew the leases. Many tenants like to go onto a month-to-month at the end of the lease. That may be fine, but you may want to charge a month-to-month fee because you don't have the security of the tenant staying for a long period of time. So there may be an additional fee you can collect for that. And also make sure to raise the rent when their lease expires, because inflation goes up, your cost goes up as the owner. So don't short sell yourself by not raising rents as leases expire. You also need to collect. If you move the tenant in, now you need to think about how do you collect rent. So you need to make sure that tenants know exactly when the rent is due. Is it due on the 1st, and do they have a grace period on 3 to 5 days? What type of payment method will you accept? Is it cash, which I will not recommend because that's very easy to commit fraud if you take cash. So I would have check, money order, or some sort of online payment. You want to make sure again to make it as easy as possible for your tenants to pay rent, and also train your tenants to pay on time. What I mean by that is if they're late, you need to file a late notice and a late fee. You want to make sure you are the #1 priority of the tenant, so they don't make you your second or third priority, and your rent becomes later and later. So be fair and firm with that. Maintenance requests. So your tenant is in, the person is paying rent on time, and occasionally things will break. Toilet gets clogged, the faucet starts leaking. There's some other problem. So you need to have a process in place for handling these maintenance requests. And this is probably a big challenge for self-management, because imagine you have a full-time job and some of your tenant calls and says, hey, the toilet is blocked. How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to call the plumber and try to find someone in the middle of the day to go and fix that? Are you going to go out on your lunch break or after work to try to fix the issues? Be very cognizant about the fact that management and maintenance can become a big headache. You need to have a process for taking these calls, and then scheduling the repair work with the professional that's going to come and repair it, or if it's yourself. Deciding who should pay. By that I mean maybe the tenant shoved a bunch of stuff down the toilet the person should have done. That really should be the tenant's responsibility to pay for that. So if the plumber comes out and pulls out stuff that shouldn't be in the toilet, well, that's probably the tenant's responsibility to pay that. There are also some landlords that have a tenant co-payment. So anytime there's a maintenance call, maybe the tenant pays $20. That will eliminate some of these unnecessary maintenance calls. But also be careful, because maybe the faucet's been leaking for years and the tenant doesn't want to pay anything, and you end up with a huge water bill. So be careful about the co-payment and understand what impact that may have on you. And when you have professional management in place, you want to make sure you have a process that they call you and say, we need to replace the refrigerator, it's going to be $500. That you have some sort of approval process in place for repairs above a certain dollar amount, so they don't just go and spend a bunch of money on your behalf without your knowledge. And at times we have to deal with delinquencies and evictions. If your tenant stops paying rent for whatever reason, make sure you understand the law. This is just kind of a general overview over it. But you need to file a notice to pay rent or vacate the property on the 3rd or the 5th day, whatever your policy is. And if they stop paying rent, try to contact them and figure out what's going on. Maybe they're sick, maybe they had to travel unexpectedly. Work with the tenant if possible. But if the tenant doesn't want to pay the rent, can't pay the rent, you need to file the eviction notice and probably work with a lawyer or somebody else to deal with that. Somebody needs to go to court, file the eviction there, and get a writ of restitution, which really allows you to call the marshal or police to evict the tenant and essentially remove them from the property. Some states are much more tenant friendly versus landlord friendly, so understand the laws in your state to see how and when you can evict tenants that hasn't paid, because that gets very expensive. Imagine 2 or 3 months of non-payment of a couple $1,000s in rent every month. That gets very expensive for you, and then maybe the tenant will start trashing the property, which is also a challenge. And if you evict the tenant, you can try to collect back rents. It's probably pretty difficult to do that, especially if it's a lower income tenant. They may not have that money, but that's another option to maybe collect some of your lost revenues there. As always, if anybody wants to get on a call with me, then go to opendoorscapital.com/call and schedule a call to chat. And next week, we're going to talk about forcing appreciation in your new property. So what are some of the upgrades and fixes we can do to increase the rents and increase the value of your property. Until next time, have a great week.